My name is Josh Weil. I'm the Regional Overdose Prevention Specialist for Shelby County. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing from University of Memphis, and I'm the Chairman of the Prevention and Education Task Force for the Shelby County Health Department. Part of my job is to address the stigma associated with addiction and to provide education regarding the disease process of addiction. So with stigma, often the behaviors associated with addiction get confused with choice or a weak willpower or a moral issue without understanding the disease process that's behind it and motivating these behaviors. First, we're going to talk about genetic susceptibility. In 1959, two doctors did an experiment with mice and rats. They inbred the mice for 20 generations, and what that ends up creating is a group or strain of mice that are genetically identical. They're about 98% genetically identical. So they took these mice and they put them in groups. They made drugs, alcohol, and water available to them. Some of the groups, the whole group would go to the drugs and alcohol over and over again. Some of the other groups would just go to the water and ignore the drugs and alcohol. And what that told us is that there is a genetic component involved in some addictions. So since then, we've mapped out the human genome. We have been able to find about 90 genes that are associated with addiction. It is not one single gene that causes addiction. It is a combination of several, and we see these genes in people with substance use disorder quite often, and it is groups of these genes. And what these genes determine are things like pleasure response, affinity to receptors, receptor sensitivity, and what this manifests as is a different experience from the same substance. So people who are predisposed to addiction have a completely different experience with that substance than someone who has a normal reaction. If we take opiates, for example, if you've ever gotten a pain pill from a doctor or dentist, most people take it and they get agitated, they get a little tired, they take it till the pain is gone and they stop. Somebody that has a genetic predisposition can take that same drug and they get a huge sense of euphoria, they get relief. It's kind of a where have you been all my life kind of moment for that person. And so what this does, it doesn't guarantee this person will have substance use disorder. It makes that person more likely to continue using and to use in larger amounts. And this is where the disease process really takes off, and we're going to look at that next. The pleasure response that we discussed happens in the septal region of the brain. The septal region contains the pleasure reward circuit, and it is responsible for desires and drives related to survival and procreation. This circuit is involved in every addiction. So what we're going to do is break down the components that are involved in this and show how each one of them works in addiction. And we're going to look at what it means to have a hijacked brain. So as human beings, our brains are equipped with a survival system. We are wired to like certain things, and our brain wants to make sure we continue doing those things. So things like food, sex, shelter, companionship, those things give us pleasure, and we have a system that actually learns and remembers and will continue to give us drives that will assure that we will continue these behaviors because they are good for our survival. Now, things like sex and food act indirectly on the pleasure center. Psychoactive substances act directly on the pleasure center, therefore you get a response that is much higher than a normal range. Now, as a chain reaction result from that, the rest of the system gets a higher response as well. And your brain is, in essence, tricked into thinking that something harmful is good for you. And it drives the person with substance use disorder to continue that behavior. Now we're talking about a very primal part of the brain. It does not react to reason. It just creates a drive. And how that works is the nucleus accumbens gets activated first. The nucleus accumbens is the pleasure center. When the nucleus accumbens gets activated, there's an area of your brain that's on the top of your brainstem. This is a very primal part of your brain. It's called the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA. Now the VTA will fire off when we experience pleasure. When the VTA fires, it releases dopamine. Now, we've all heard of dopamine, and it was initially thought that dopamine was causing pleasure. And the reason for that is because dopamine release is elevated in every single addiction we've ever studied. Now, something about that didn't make sense because people with Parkinson's disease, they have low dopamine, but they still experience pleasure. There was a study done where mice were genetically engineered, some of them to have no dopamine, some of them to have extra dopamine. And the result of that was the mice with extra dopamine moved quicker. They responded to food quicker, sex quicker, they were much faster, but they didn't experience any more pleasure. The mice that didn't have dopamine would sit and starve to death with food right next to them. They had to be hand-fed, but the level of pleasure wasn't any less. So what we've determined is that dopamine is not pleasure, it is motivation. It is motivation to continue to do something. And when we have that big pleasure response, which is about 5 to 10 times larger than normal, we also get a bigger response from the VTA. So the VTA releases a mass amount of dopamine. And this dopamine causes that drive to continue to do something. So it is like a want, but it is not a want in a logical way where you plan something out, think about it, decide you're going to do it. This is a craving. This is a drive to where the person actually feels like they want to do this, and they usually feel like they want to do it more than anything else. They will put things aside. They will do it before they eat. They will let relationships go. They will let homes go, jobs go, because their brain is telling them that this is the most important thing they have to do. Now, as human beings, we have a prefrontal cortex. That's the other segment of the brain that's involved in this, and that inhibits this system. See, we have the power to override that. Now, if any of you have ever tried to diet and decided you're gonna have just chicken and brown rice today, but by 12 noon you have a chocolate donut in your mouth, that's the same system that's driving this. And if you couldn't keep from eating that chocolate donut, imagine a drive 5 times stronger than that. Now, another part of the problem is that prefrontal cortex changes also with continued substance use. And what we see is a reduction in mass, so it actually gets smaller. We see less activity in that area of the brain. And we also see that the nerve endings actually get deformed and misshapen. So our ability to inhibit our drives goes down, and the drives become more and more sensitive as use goes on, and they become greater. So that's the battle that somebody that has an addiction is facing. And this is true for every addiction, even non-substance addictions, we see this same process. So what we're looking at is the survival system gone awry, and an individual who has lost the power of choice of whether they're going to continue to do this or not. Their brain is now running the show, and their ability to inhibit these primal urges has diminished greatly. So it is a battle that most of the time cannot be won by that individual. That's why the process has to be interrupted, and that's what treatment is for. So we can get that person's brain back to a level to where they don't feel the urge as strongly, and we can put them in some sort of program, whether it be MAT or total abstinence, whatever fits that person the best is where we want to try to get them. So, to recap, we've talked about genetic susceptibility, which shows that some people are more likely to continue the use of a substance than others because of their reaction to it, which is different. And then we've talked about the septal region of the brain that contains the reward circuit system, which is the part of the brain that gets hijacked in addiction. That the primal brain takes over, and these desires and drive outweigh the inhibitory ability of that person to deny those drives. So that person is in essence not in control. And what we hope you get out of this, particularly if you work in this field, is the knowledge of what's going on behind the behavior, and the need to stop looking at the behavior and pointing fingers and making this about willpower and choice when there is something else driving the bus. That person does not have a choice whether they're going to continue or not. And on that basis, we want to look at addiction as a disease. The American Medical Association has labeled addiction a disease since the 1950s. And there's a lot of great research out there, about 80 years worth, that backs that up. So hopefully this will answer some questions for you and help you go back out into society with a different view on what addiction really is. So I'd like to ask each of you to take a look at your own personal bias regarding addiction, your own views and ideas of what this behavior means and what exactly addiction is. And if you find that you have some ideas that involve choice, or that it's that person's fault, or that if they were a better person, then they wouldn't be addicted, I would suggest that you go out and look for research to back that up. And what most likely you will find is research that opposes that. So everyone, particularly if you are in this field, I think needs to be educated on what this disease is and what's going on in the brain and why we are seeing these behaviors. And hopefully the way we treat our own clients will fall in line with our new views on addiction. I would like to thank everyone for taking time to watch this presentation and hope that everybody comes away from it with something new that they can use somewhere in their life.